Welcome to In the Studio with Kevin Blythe Sampson. We are so delighted that you're joining us this evening. My name is Persephone Allen, and I am the manager of adult public programs at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. As many of you know, AFAM, our museum is dedicated to the appreciation and understanding of self-taught art across time and place. And our galleries at Lincoln Square have reopened. They're open now. So you can book tickets online for free to see works from our current exhibition, American Perspectives. And a link for tickets will be shared in an email following tonight's program. If you enjoy the program, know that you can donate to support ongoing virtual events like this one and all of the amazing experiences online we have coming up. A link for donating will be in the same email with a survey following the program, and we really appreciate your feedback and your support. We are grateful for opportunities like this to connect together online, which would not be possible without the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and Art Bridges. And as we tune in from our homes this evening, we want to take a moment, as we always do with virtual programs, to express our gratitude for all of the healthcare workers continuing to combat the ongoing pandemic in our communities and around the world. Just a few notes to begin. This is a webinar, so we won't be able to see or hear attendees, but we hope you share questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and add comments in the chat. We'll make every effort to respond to as many questions as possible at the end of the program. Tonight's conversation is being recorded, and we will share the recording following tonight's event. Many thanks to our colleague, Richard Ho, Director of IT, for his technical support tonight. Kevin's sculpture, Blue Meat, is featured in our current exhibition, American Perspectives, which showcases stories and artworks from the museum's collection, curated by Stacy C. Hollander. But the genesis for tonight's program really came out of conversations I had with artists Bisa Butler and Dr. Myra Brown Green, who joined us for a virtual program earlier this year in August and spoke about Kevin's Mother Oatman sculpture. And we're really delighted to have Myra on the call tonight. So this is exciting to be here together. We're really also very thrilled to have Kevin here tonight as such a gifted artist and storyteller whose artwork celebration of Black history, culture, and activism speak to our own current critical moment. Kevin Blythe Sampson is a sculptor, painter, and muralist, recognized for tackling difficult issues that concern him and his neighbors in Newark, New Jersey. Born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, he grew up in a household committed to civil rights and community concerns, and this continues to be a recurring theme throughout his work. A retired police officer, Kevin worked for the city of Scotch Plains, New Jersey for over 20 years and was the first African-American composite sketch artist in the country. Following his retirement from the police force, Kevin taught at the Newark School of Fine and Industrial Art for over 16 years until the school's closure in 1995. He continues to teach at various art schools and community programs, including Express Newark and Rutgers University's Paul Robeson Gallery. He has been represented by Kevin Morris Gallery in New York since 1992, and his work is included in the collections of AFAM and the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art in Chicago, among many others. His work has been supported by grants from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, as well as residencies at the Marie Walsh Sharp Art Foundation, the John Michael Kohler Art Center, the Joan Mitchell Center, the Mystic Seaport Museum, and most recently, the Mariposa Museum. Kevin was also recently selected as one of the 100 people in Newark by the 100 People Foundation. So thank you again for joining us this evening, Kevin. To begin tonight's program, I was wondering if you could just introduce us to your practice, speaking to how and when you began making work.
Hi, as you know, I'm Kevin Blythe Sampson. I live in Newark, New Jersey in the Ironbound section. I've always been an artist. I've always made artwork. I started out with illustration. I taught airbrushing techniques for 16 or so years. I began making sculptures after a series of tragedies in the early 90s. So when I had, lost a wife, I lost a kid, and after that, I needed something to do with my hands. So I turned to making sculptures, although I didn't know they were sculptures at the time. They were just a way of healing myself. The photos that are being used in this presentation were all created by a local photographer, young photographer, Caesar Melgar, who I started teaching when he's 15. He's in his studies now. He's definitely one of Newark's finest artists by far, and he's probably has become my teacher. As you can see with the first slide, this is me sitting, working in my studio. I have to think back to what one of my greatest teachers, who is also the owner of Calvin Morris, Calvin Morris Gallery in New York, my gallery since 1992. Randall Morris, he said many years ago that artists like myself live with their work. So my studio is any place that I actually can make work. This first piece, which I think Calvin Morris has right now, is I'm not sure if the titles aren't down below, but I think it's Georgie Boy. It's dealing with when George Bush was president. It was dealing with him when he started the Iraq War. This was actually made from an ashtray that I had because I wanted to use something foul, and I covered it in cement. And this is one of my earliest pieces, which is at Calvin Morris Gallery. This piece, if you look up top, you can see that that they're actually chicken bones that are incorporated into the piece. I got to think about chicken bones. Chicken bones represent family, history, and magic. So I use them in many of my pieces. In the middle of this piece is a little tiny shield, which is meant to collect energy. A lot of my pieces, I think in terms of being magical objects instead of art objects. This piece is in the collection of the American Museum of Folk Art. I think it's called Blue Meat. It's actually made with the neck of a elk. A couple of friends of mine were camping in Montana and they found this this beautiful neck bone of an elk or a moose, and they shipped it all the way back to me, and I created this piece. On the top of this piece is a little scene of the Garden of Eden. So, in my mind, I call it Adam and Eve. This is titled Blue Meat because of a conversation I had with Randall Morris in a restaurant after opening, where my whole family was there. My father was talking about the Depression and how they were so hungry that they actually ate crows, and that crows had blue meat. And of course, my spiritual friends were simply horrified. So we got into a big discussion about, was it worth eating a spirit animal, even though you were starving to death? And I was like, yeah, I would eat you. It's a wooden base. Again, this is the neck bone of an elk. And I use a lot of cement in my pieces. I came up with a process of turning things into cement. This is a photo of my piece in the current exhibition at the American Museum of Folk Art. This piece is The Pearl. John Foster, a great friend and a curator from the Midwest, actually sent me a whole box of bogles, bangles, and beads. And from the stuff that John sent me, I created this piece. This piece is called Red Stripe. I made this piece after returning from a trip to Jamaica with Randall Morris. Randall and I went on an art collecting trip, and we actually drove the island of Jamaica, the whole island, a couple of times, meeting with artists all over the island. Earl McKenzie and Everett Brown and David Boxer. We met the whole gambit of Jamaican self-taught artists and contemporary artists. And, we even ventured to Kingston. I think that's where we met up with David Boxer, Patrona Morris, and that old crowd. Next. I have a thing about sculptures. So, I've been thinking about musical instruments. So this piece, there was a guitar that was broken, and it was broken and the contents was thrown over blocks and blocks and blocks. So I spent probably a week or two picking up each little broken piece of this guitar. I returned home with it and I reconfigured it into this piece here. So I like to think that a lot of my work is putting out a sort of sound, a sort of music. And so I have to think about musical instruments. This piece I did after returning from Venice in 2011. The American Museum of Folk Art sent a group of us self-taught artists to the Venice Biennale in 2011. Of course, everything collapsed a week before we were supposed to go, but we still wound up going. And that group was Lonnie Holly, Charlie Lucas, and Mr. Imagination. And so when I returned from Venice, I created this piece. And so if you were to look at it closely, you can see all the little alleyways. I mean, Venice was so beautiful that you would turn the corner and just break down in tears. I mean, it was exhausting in its beauty. And I spent 5 weeks, if you can imagine, locked in a space with Lonnie Holly, Charlie Lucas, and Mr. Imagination. But they treated me like the kids. So what I did was each and every one of them took me aside and actually showed me how they did the work. And more importantly, they showed me how they thought. I learned a lot from Lonnie, from Mr. I, and Charlie Lucas. And of course, Mr. Imagination was actually dying the whole time during this trip. So it was a life-changing trip. We were supposed to do a big piece in the post office of Venice, but because the show collapsed, we didn't have any place to make our work. So when the Venetians heard about our plight, they opened up a 1,000-year-old garden to us, and they let us create a show in this 1,000-year-old garden that even the people in Venice had never seen before. It was extraordinary. Next, we're going to move on to a film. This film was created by Cesar Melgar, photographer Cesar Melgar, who actually created this film of my work. If you could stop this for a moment, this is a poster that either I got or my older brother Ron got when in high school, back probably in the late 60s, early 70s. As you can see, it deals with the Black Panthers. I've kept this all of these years. Hanging over it, when I recently had a residency in 2018 at the Arts and Industry program in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, I found the antlers of an elk in the backyard. I brought them home, and I thought that it was just appropriate that they hang over Bobby Seale.
And Kevin, I just want to jump in and ask, can you tell us a little bit about where this studio is and what, if we were to visit you in person, what we might encounter?
Well, my studio is located 6 blocks from Penn Station in Newark. It's in the Ironbound section of Newark, which is predominantly, well, it was predominantly Portuguese and Brazilian. Now it's leaning more towards South American, but it's another country here. There are days where I don't hear English spoken, which is fine with me. So if you were to come visit me, I'm 6 blocks from Penn Station. And my studio is gigantic. I've been living here for 25 years, I guess. My landlord is one of my best buddies, Ronald Nitty, who owns one of the oldest wood shops in Newark. So all I have to do is walk downstairs to make my work and to get a lot of my materials. I go into the wood shop, hang out with the master Italian and Portuguese artist, and collect a lot of my materials, most of my materials, from right downstairs.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
I guess we're going to move on. So what you're getting now is a tour of, I could call it my studio, but it's my house. Again, like Randall said, artists like myself tend to live with their work. And so my kids grew up with all of these sculptures all around them. I mean, it's a part of our house. It's a part of our furniture. We'll hang clothes on it. I mean, it's just, we don't take it that seriously. These are pieces that I made, and collected. If you see, for instance, there's a dress right there. This pink dress was a dress that I found out in the street. I brought it home over 20-something years ago and hung it. And it just represented, when I find pieces like this, I think of who owned them and how forgotten these people were. And this beautiful dress was discarded in the street, and I just wanted to more or less give it a home. That's an African mask that my Aunt Fennell actually gave me. So I put that on top of the piece. I collect so much stuff that my son, my oldest son, Jason, who lives with me, will sometimes stop me at the door, don't bring anything else in. The piece that you see here, the brown piece on the chair, I actually created at the Art and Industry program in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. There's all kind of stuff stuffed in every little compartment. I'm not a hoarder, but I might be close to it.
And could we pause here and talk a little bit about these sculptures that we're seeing? They're so dense and really visually exciting. I'd love to hear a little bit more about these pieces.
Well, if you move up a bit, the sculpture here, as you can see, it's a sculpture right here in front of us. My kids probably have gotten very annoyed with me because, I mean, every time we eat anything to do with chicken, anything to do with bones, they're not allowed to throw out the bones. So we collect them. I got a thing about bones and about the power and the history of bones. This piece right in front of you is dedicated to the Haitian poisoner in the Revolution, Mackandal, who taught Haitians how to poison the slave masters. So I wanted to make a really intense piece. This guitar, it's in the shape of a guitar. Ronald Nitty downstairs, my landlord and friend and woodshop owner, actually created a shape, a mold of a guitar. He made it out of wood. And from that, I was able to fill it in with bones and other objects. And again, using cement, I cement everything in. These things are very, very strong. The piece next to it, if you see, is the vacuum cleaner. Okay, I guess we jumped ahead. This is my altar. This piece here, if we could hold up a second, the piece right here, I call this ball gown. When I first moved to Newark, my first studio was on Chestnut Street. Chestnut Street is the place that I think the whole art scene in Newark grew out of. This was a place that I lived with, there was different artists there, including Willie Coles, Eve Sadler, Brett Cook, Disney, Manuel Acevedo. There was a whole bunch of artists that lived in this one little artist commune. And I think that a lot of what grew into the Newark art scene was fermented right inside that space. I'm a widower, so I raised my kids, alone since they were, very young teens. So I had to assume this big macho police officer had to become mommy and daddy. So I used to make jokes about me, being mommy. And so I started making a series of dresses titled Beulah's Ball Gown. Beulah was actually my grandmother's name. Yes. And as you can see, I've worked from all over the place. Whatever I see, whatever interests me, I bring home. Beulah's Ball Gown, as you can see even here, those are actually hot peppers. I made this piece probably in 1992, and all of it has still survived because I figured out a technique of preserving things. If you go up a little, if you can continue a little bit, you see baby shoes, and there's also a little bag here. There it is. There's a little bag here of cotton. My father's from Cuthbert, Georgia, and he returned to his home, which had been demolished. But he walked out in the field and he found cotton that, he grew up picking cotton. So, but he found a bag of cotton. He brought it back home to me, and I've kept it all these years. That's probably 40 years old. I collect saints. And when I find a saint of Jesus or so, I paint him brown. My father, who was a civil rights leader, when he went into African-American churches and he would see a white Jesus on the wall, he would instantly go over and take it down. He didn't care what church he was in. And he would also always say that Jesus had hair like sheep's wool and skin like burnt copper. So whenever I find a new Jesus, or most often when I find a new Jesus, I'll paint them brown. again, my studio is just loaded with objects. This piece is probably the first piece that I actually created. It was dedicated to my cousin, Carol Oliver. She died of, my favorite cousin. She contracted AIDS in the late 80s, early 90s, and she died at Cardinal Cook Hospital. This is before we even knew what AIDS was. So I was so, at the same time, I just lost a child. Crack had hit all over. And so, you know, Newark looked like Night of the Living Dead. And so all of these people were dying. So anyway, I wanted to join her in her journey to the other side. So I created a figure that resembled her. And my Aunt Vanell, after, my cousin Carol, before she died, turned to Santeria, which my Aunt Vanell couldn't stand. So after she died, she gave me all of these objects that my cousin used in her practice. And I took these objects and I walked in the backyard, I found a log, and I created this piece. It's actually a ship. And this was my way of joining her on the voyage to the next life. And as you can see, my whole studio, living room is just loaded with pieces. I've actually run out of room now. So I actually create a lot of my work downstairs because I simply don't have the room. You know, as a sculpture, you see, you know, as a sculpture, that's a common thing. You know, you just simply run out of room, which I have now. So I've actually turned to painting because of that. I got to think about boats, about sails, about anything that moves. The piece in the corner there, I had a studio space at the Marie Ward Sharp Foundation in New York in about 1993. So I would walk along the West Side Highway collecting junk. This is before it was gentrified and beautified. It was, you know, this is when New York started. They say it was the real New York, funky and a little bit crazy. But that piece in the corner that looks like a lamp, I actually walked, you know, near the water, picked it up and created a piece out of it.
Kevin, I think, is this the altar you were speaking about earlier?
Yes. Yeah, this is
pause
my,
here.
okay, if this is my altar. On this altar, actually, again, I mentioned that I lost a child. So this altar is actually dedicated to my son, Kyle, who I lost. And so these are saints that I've actually purchased and collected and found all around Newark. And I took them and I put them on this altar and I created this this piece dedicated to my son. People ask me, do you pray to the saints and do you pray to that? It's more or less a nod that I give to people that do. You know, I believe in all religions. I believe they're all basically, you know, the same. And so as long as you believe in something, I believe that's what's important. If you look next to the altar, there's a photo of my father. Don't know if you can see it clearly. There's a photo of my father leading a civil rights movement. It was a march for open housing in the city of Elizabeth back in 1962. So I'm a civil rights baby. I grew up marching on picket lines. I was on picket lines before I could walk. And again, just various objects. Well, there it goes. You can see it closer. So, I mean, I grew up along with my brothers and sisters. They would actually take us and lay us across the street to block traffic. And so because of my father, my father's one of the brightest men I knew and one of the blackest, proudest man I probably have ever met to this day. But because of him and his connections in the civil rights movement, I grew up meeting civil rights luminaries like Dick Gregory, and Shirley Chisholm was a frequent dinner guest at my house, Ruby Dee, Ossie Davis. My father even told me that I met Malcolm X as a child at the 125th bookstore. I don't remember. But I grew up with this household full of communists and professors and civil rights leaders, William Kunstler. I mean, there was a whole crowd of them that came around my house. So I was too little. I look back on it now, wishing that I were a little older so I could remember more. And again, if you look, my whole house is covered with stuff on every inch of my walls. So I'm just, these are masks and stuff that go back to, I didn't start making sculptures to late 80s, early 90s. Before then I was a painter, you know, an illustrator. Grief and loss drove me into the need to use my hands to do something different. I think ultimately I would have wound up making sculptures anyway, but it just kind of fueled the whole thing. If you look now, you can see there's a group of paintings. I've actually completed 36 paintings since the pandemic started in March. So all I do is I wake up and I paint, and I go to bed painting.
Incredible. And it's really wonderful to have this behind the scenes visit to your studio space, because I can only imagine with such a large group as we are tonight, we would not all fit in this space where it's so densely packed with objects you've collected and objects you've made.
Yes, and I mean it's my, you know, it's my home, and again, my kids grew up with these objects. They grew up playing on them and playing with them. I used to use a lot of chicken feet, which I would dehydrate and put on my sculptures. And I had two dogs that actually would go right behind me and eat the chicken feet off and leave the sculptures alone. This piece is titled For Dead in Ohio. It's dedicated to, there's a group of kids that were actually, a group of college kids were actually in a playground here in Newark, and they were shot and killed. I think there was 3 or 4 of them. So I dedicated a piece to them, referring it to the song For Dead and, you know, 10 soldiers and For Dead in Ohio. I use my work, my daughter couldn't stand them, so I had to stop using dolls. The women in my family have a thing about dolls, so I can't use them. This piece that you're coming up on now is this piece right there is actually the Uss Sarah Palin. So I actually made this piece when Sarah Palin was the vice presidential running mate for John McCain. And inside this piece are a lot of, you know, dinosaurs and glasses and madness. These pieces are actually welders' masks, which were actually in the embassy in Indonesia when it was bombed. This drawing, you know, I started out, you know, as an illustrator. I wanted to do book illustration, and I wanted to illustrate record albums. We all know where that went. So I actually made this piece for Malcolm X's daughter, Malak. There was a point going back in the early 90s that I was hanging out with Malak through a friend of mine, Reynolds, my best female buddy's Reynolds. She's a teacher at the Brooklyn Museum. And she was, her and Malak were really good friends. So I actually made this drawing for Malak. But before I could give it to her, her mother died in the fire, and Malak, you know, vanished for a bit. So I've kept it all these years. These are the pieces I was talking about. I did 2 pieces that were made out of welders' masks. I did these very early on, probably in 1990. And these pieces were actually in the embassy, in the Indonesian embassy. And it was bombed. And they sent them back to me, and they were covered in soot and smoke. And I think that makes it even more, makes them even more interesting. This is actually a piece that belongs to Randall. I got to send this back to you, by the way. It was supposed to be in a benefit, which never sold. So this actually belongs to Randall Morris.
And I think, sorry to jump in, Kevin, I'd want to say that at this point, it might be a good time to go back to some of your sculptures before we start to talk about the paintings. Because I know we
Okay,
have more images of your paintings at the end of your PowerPoint.
yes. This piece, I was reading up on slavery, and there was a slave ship that actually sunk with 200 slaves on board. So I kept thinking about, how haunted this ship must be at the bottom of the ocean, what a miserable, sad place it must be. So I created this ship dedicated to those 200 slaves that died, on the voyage over here. This is dedicated to Ra, the Egyptian god, and it was about crossing over, how he would cross over to the other side. This piece is owned by the Newark Museum. I've fallen in love with boats. There's something about boats and the sea that I've always responded to. I think in my other life I was a fisherman. I love the water. I don't want to get in it, but I love to look at it. But there's something about the sea that has always deeply affected me. I think it was 2017 at the Andrew Elgin Gallery in New York. Andrew's a great friend. He invited a group of muralists to come in and complete murals. He gave us 7 days and 7 nights. This was before his gallery moved. So this was like the last month before the gallery moved to another part of New York. So I created this with my crew, the Rusty Thorn crew, which is composed of Caesar Melgard, James Wilson, Manuel Acevedo, Jerry Gant, and my daughter Lauren. So we created this piece. This was done during the time when they had the shooting in the church, where all those folks were killed. So we wanted to do something that dealt with current events. So, and as you can see, times have not changed that much. This piece, the Cow Kool-Aid, I did this in 2000, what is this? I can't think of the year. In 2018. I did this at the Mystic Seaport Museum. At the Mystic Seaport Museum, I was invited to do the first residency that they had this. So I went up to the Mystic Seaport Museum and I helped them design a residency program. They wanted to bring more diversity into the museum because it's a museum that deals with American history, but that a lot of that history is painful to people of color. For instance, they redid the Amistad, the ship, and they were like, "Don't you want to go board it?" And I'm like, "No, I don't want to go board a slave ship. Why would I?" So they were trying to bring more diversity into the museum. So they invited me up there. I was the first one that they ever allowed to walk around the grounds of the museum and collect objects. So I was able to collect objects that were hundreds of years old. They gave me this ancient vessel to use, and I created the Cow Kool-Aid. Cow Kool-Aid is an African song, an African call and response song, which is widely used all over Africa. This is one of my more recent pieces. I did it probably a year and a half ago. It's the USS Enterprise. People are like, well, what is that? Well, as in Star Trek. I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek. And if you were to see it sideways, you could actually see the things that come off, like the USS Enterprise. So, again, boats are my thing. Right. I was fortunate to be able to, this past summer, be invited to the Mariposa Museum in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard. As you know, Oak Bluffs is the historically African-American part of the Martha's Vineyard. Clara, who's the director of the Mariposa Museum there, had an idea to invite me up because she wanted to talk about what was going on, which was the Black Lives Matter movement and all the protests. So my background, which is kind of diverse, being that I'm African-American and I'm also a retired police officer, she invited me up to the museum. I have a wonderful relationship with this museum. Anyway, I created an installation based on the legend of the Flying Africans. The legend of the Flying Africans is all about, there was a slave ship that the slaves took over the slave ship, but they couldn't. They killed the masters, but they couldn't steer the ship. So they crashed into the swamps, and they disembarked, and the chief decided that we're not going to be slaves. I'm not going to allow my people to be slaves. So he had everybody, all of the slaves committed suicide in the swamps. That's how history tells the story. The slaves that lived on nearby plantations came up with another explanation. They said that the Africans walked into the swamps, they grew wings, and they flew back to Africa. So I prefer to think of it, that event, in that way. So I created this piece. A lot of this stuff I have collected over the course of 30 years. Some of this stuff's a Mystic Seaport Museum. Other stuff was donated by the public. The African-American community in Oak Bluffs came out in force, and they donated a lot of materials, and I was able to create this piece. So I wanted to think of the Black Lives Matter movement as these Africans who refused to submit to slavery. And again, I put on the top of this, there's a doll that I carry around every place with me. She's my good luck my good luck charm, and she's my power person. So I actually left her there. I miss her. And she's at the top of this boat, and she really represents the kids in the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, since the virus has hit and locked us all away, I didn't want to go and collect objects. I didn't want to touch anything. So I actually had to stop making sculptures back in February. So I have to make artwork. Making artwork is like breathing to me. So I returned to painting. Since I started in March, I've done 36, actually more, but I'll say 36 paintings. And they started out being about humans, but I've got a little disgust with mankind. So recently I returned to, for the first time, to landscapes. This is the legend of the spider grandmother, which is a Native American legend. And I wanted to do something dealing with Native Americans or Latinx folks. I have spent probably almost 2 months in Italy since 2011. I was recently in Italy, Ortenna, Italy in 2018. Architects came from all over the world to design a new city that works for the people. So I was invited there along with Caesar Melgar, and we spent 2 weeks in Ortenna, Italy, which is a city that's probably 1,000 years old. It's a province of Rome. And so Italy is on my brain, and it doesn't hurt that my son-in-law is Italian and Cuban. So, and I'm always in Staten Island with the Italian crowd in Staten Island. So Italy's always on my brain.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about your creative practice. I think that we really had this amazing, insightful look into your work and the stories behind your work, which are so powerful. So at this point, we'd like to open it up for Q&A, and I see that we have some questions, and I'll start to share these. And then for everyone who's with us on the call tonight, we really encourage you to submit your questions. We want to hear from you and what you're interested in hearing from Kevin. So I'm going to share first question, which is that Kevin, you talked a lot about your father and the influence that he had on your life. Did your mother influence your work as well?
Well, my father wouldn't have been anything without my mother. So, I mean, my mother was a librarian. And for instance, when I first became a police officer, I went to a historically Black school. I went to Lincoln University in 1972. And I left after a year and a half. When I came back home, my father said, well, you're not going to lay around my house, boy. The mayor was recruiting African-Americans, or my father was recruiting African-Americans to become police officers. So he said, well, it wouldn't look good unless my son takes the test. So I took the test. But in the meantime, my mother was like, well, if you have to be a police officer, you're going to do this. So she said, get in the car. She drove me to the post office. She took me to the wall and showed me wanted posters. And she says, well, if you're going to be a police officer, you're going to do this. You're not going to give up on your art. So my mother was the one that first suggested me becoming a police composite artist. My mother was my best friend. You know, she was always in my head. My father may have been my role model, but my mother was my best friend. She's the one that, you know, nurtured me, taught me, and encouraged me. My mother encouraged my art. My father thought the art was crazy, if that makes any sense. My father liked my artwork when it dealt with protests. But when I moved into sculpture, he didn't get it. And his feeling was, if you're not doing something to support your people and fight back, and I'm like, Dad, but I'm making pieces that are political. I don't want to hear it. You know, he liked the drawings. But my mother was very important. And my Aunt Vanell, my mother's sister, was actually the director of the New Lincoln School in New York. She's the one that introduced me to Charles White and Jacob Lawrence. I mean, I had the posters hanging on my wall in grammar school because she knew all of them. And so, I mean, my aunt was director of New Lincoln School, and out of that school came Thelma Golden, Adrian Piper, Michelle Wallace, Susan Lee Pace. And so, because of my aunt, between my aunt and my mother, my exposure to art was pretty good. I mean, the New Lincoln School was founded with parents. So it was Robert Rauschenberg, Zero Mostel, and Faith Ringo. They were the parents that actually powered the school that my aunt taught at. So that's how I got so connected into different elements of the art world. It was through my Aunt Vanell and her connections.
You know, it's so incredible to hear from you about all of these influences and how interconnected your world is with so many other people whose names are familiar to us from the art world and from activism. So this relates to one of the questions that we have here about what was your relationship to making art as a young person, as a child? It sounds like you're really growing up in the art world. So if you could speak to, you know, being a younger person and making work.
It was, you know, my father was a self-taught African-American historian. So African-American history was taught at every moment of my childhood. It was taught, my father was a Sunday school teacher, and he taught Bible stories through the African-American experience. And on my mother's side, they were all college professors. My uncle was Dr. Clinton Oliver, the first tenured professor at Queens College, English lit professor. So I had all of these different influences teaching not just me, but my siblings. But I had a cousin, Virginia, who actually was probably the strongest woman I've ever met. She became an artist very early on, lived in Paris for a time, and lived in Africa for a very long time. And she told me very early on, probably when I was 12 years old, hey, you paint like a Haitian. So all of these influences were, you know, and again, my Aunt Vanell's friends were Samella Lewis, Elizabeth Catlett, Bernie Casey, you know, and I actually own, and we actually own work from those artists. After she passed on, my aunt, she donated it to, you know, to us. So that was always in my head, but African-American history was always in my head. It was always such a part of my upbringing that art had to be a part of that.
It's incredible. I really am so grateful that you're sharing this with us tonight and welcoming us into that circle. There's a question here that relates to your process, and I see that we have a few questions related to process. So the question is, when you create your paintings that you've been working on during the pandemic, are you working from source images, you know, from photographs, or are these coming directly from your imagination?
You know, I mean, I always have, I never do anything right out of my head. You know, people always say you look so spontaneous. I'm the least spontaneous person in the whole universe. I do research, I read constantly. I'll do images. What I do is I'll find a series of images, 3 or 4, and I'll just combine them. I'll take a little of this, but that's a standard practice of an illustrator. We were taught, when I was in school for illustration, we were taught that you never completely copy anybody's work. Whatever you look at, you have to change. So what I'll do is I'll find a photo of a boat, and then I'll find a landscape, and I'll combine these images. And then once I get in my head what I want to do, I'll research whatever subject it is. So half the fun is looking up what I want to do. If I'm doing a boat, I'll find the actual boat, and I'll read the story. If I'm doing boat wrecks, I'll find shipwrecks, and I'll look up this particular boat. So all the titles that I use with the boats in my painting are actual boats. I like researching obsessively.
It's clear from the titles of your works and from the amount of history that you shared tonight. I think the enthusiasm there, you really convey it, and I think we all learn so much through hearing those stories from you. So I have another question here about process. This is from Denicia, who is actually one of our current interns with the museum. We're thrilled that she's here tonight. And Denicia asks, how malleable is cement as a medium to work with? And I think that's really fascinating because we heard you frequently say how much you're using cement in your work.
Yeah, and I make it sound simpler than it is. It's just not, you don't just grab it, put cement on it, and it works. No, I have a whole process that you have to go through using cement. I use quick cement. So you have to work with this very, very quickly. You have to know what you want to do, because if you don't, it's done and there's no undoing it. You have to know what you're doing before you use the cement, because once you do, it's done. And there's no turning back unless you want to hammer and a chisel. So, but it's not as easy. I don't know if I want to give out on my whole process online, but it's not just as easy as dipping something in cement. There's a lot more to it than just that.
Thank you. And another question that's related to your process and to your relationship to history and research is, what are the books that are important to you, the ones you return to time and again? Or, I would expand that and say, is there something that you've been reading recently that's been really inspiring for you?
As I get older, I read a lot less, but I read all day long on the computer. The books that still remain in my head are still many of the books that I read as a child: Man, Child, and Promised Land, Down These Mean Streets, 1984, Clockwork Orange. I mean, all the books I rejected in my youth are the ones that I'm probably returning to, as I get older. I became a great reader of, when I was a police officer. I hope nobody on my job is watching this, but when I was a police officer, I would read 3 to 4 books a week, every single week. But I come from, again, my mother was a librarian, and my aunt Vanell, after she retired from the little Lincoln School, went to work for the Gilder Foundation in New York. Richard Gilder was her best friend. So she became a director there, and she set up libraries, hundreds of them, all over. And so reading, my sister Donna, my daughter, everybody in my family reads. But I do most of my reading online now, 99%. I really don't have even the time now to sit back. I'm not that relaxed even to be able to sit back and read a book like that. Whatever I read is online. I probably read 15 newspapers a day. I'm a big political buff and big history buff, so that's what I read.
There's a comment here where someone's remarking on the difficulty of balancing political content in artwork. But they write, looking at your work, the political statement seems to be integral. How conscious are you of making this political statement? Or is it just such an intrinsic part of your life that this is inherent to your work?
Well, I mean, I'm African-American, and people try to separate religion from being African-American, but I grew up in a family where religion and politics were intricately linked. The civil rights movement came out of the church. I used to be, it's funny, the pandemic has freed me from politics. Donald Trump, that thing, has freed me from politics. I used to live and breathe for it, but I've been so disgusted these last 3 years that I can't even look at it till this man gets out of office. So when the pandemic hit, all the photographers ran to photographing the demonstrations and the Black Lives Matter movement ad nauseum. Everybody thinks all the galleries are showing Black stuff. Everybody wants to be, showing Black, Black, Black. So what I did was, and I taught my students, if they go right, go left. And so what I did was, with my paintings, I actually took the politics out. And to be honest, I never felt so free, because now I can just paint what I feel, paint what I see, and I don't have this great obligation to regurgitate something that deals with politics, because everybody's doing it, and everybody's doing it so much that I think the nation's actually exhausted. And so what I did was I've actually freed myself from politics for a moment in my work, and it's been beautiful.
I think about the colors in your paintings, which to me feel so rich and vibrant, especially on a day like today where it poured rain and was very overcast. So I very much feel the freedom that you're expressing. And I think that you're conveying that. We have a technical question here about your sculptures. And this is, do you create a wireframe for the sculpture? And besides concrete, do you use other adhesives?
Yeah, I mean, concrete was my thing probably 20 years ago, but as you get older, you get freer, you get more minimalist. And so I use much less concrete. I rarely use it now. What I do is I live above, like I said, the biggest, oldest wood shop in Newark. So I go downstairs and I have access to all kind of scrap wood, every kind of thing, and it's already cut down, it's already little. So what I've been doing now is I always build a frame, but the frames I build now are out of wood. 20 years ago, I probably used wire, but now everything is wood, and the more carpentry is sunk into me, a lot, you get better at it. So I build wooden frames and I build on top of that. I don't think I've used cement probably in 5 years. You know what I mean?
It's
But
great to hear.
what I'm finding out now is, and one of my Caesar was here the other day and he asked me, "Don't you miss sculptures?" And I told him, "No, because I'm so obsessive. Whatever I'm on for that moment is it. So once I get locked onto something like these paintings, it's going to take me maybe another year to just break out mentally so I can let it go." And so, do I miss sculptures? What I am enjoying is these installations that I've been allowed to do at the Mystic Seaport, at the Mariposa Museum. I like working bigger. People think that when you say you're self-taught, you want to be locked into collecting junk. Me and Lottie laughed about it, and all of us laughed about it in Italy. If we could work with bronze, we would. You know what I mean? This is just soul food because we're poor folks and we got to use what we got. But if I could work with things, I'd work with bronze. I work with iron. I would work with, I would buy the materials. As I get older, I don't have this need to. I've connected enough with the public. I connected enough with materials. All of that is done. I just want to make art now. And the quicker I can make it, the easier I can make it, the better.
Well, maybe we have someone with a bronze casting studio on this call who will make that possible. I think it's really fabulous to hear about, future projects and what you see going into the time after this. And I feel like you're really bringing us into this process. And I would love to see what your work in bronze would look like, because I feel like you showed us that piece from the Kohler Center that was brown, and it felt so different from your other works.
I'm changing and growing, if you look at, and people look at us like you can't change. Lonnie Holly's a great example. I was there when Martha Henry, who was in charge of our trip to Venice, her sister gave Lonnie Holly a computer before we went. I sat and showed Lonnie how to use a computer, how to make images, and look at Lonnie now. We're all growing, we're all, benefiting. And I've been a teacher for 30 years, so people are like, "Are you self-taught?" I think I started out self-taught. I don't know what self-taught is anymore. I don't know how long you stay self-taught. I could use a thing that my artist friends say, "Hey, we're all self-taught." Yeah, in a lot of ways. I think that because of the way I started creating the work at the beginning, and that it came truly out of pain, that people like Randall Moss were able to see where it actually came from. So they knew that it was honest, that my intentions were honest in the beginning. I don't know if they are anymore. I'm a 70-year-old man now, I'm a pretty jaded creature.
Well, for someone who's jaded, we just received a comment that your scholarly artistic approach is reviving their sense of mankind. So I think you're really providing a lot of inspiration to all of us on the call tonight. And to close our Q&A and to close the program, there's a comment from your neighbor, Damon, coming from Elizabeth and living today in Newark. Damon's curious to hear your reflections on the North Jersey landscape and what makes it a unique place. And to hear, this is a hard question to end with, because I feel like this is one that we could spend a lot more time on, but the question is also about your relationships to the Newark art community.
The Newark art scene, again, you you showed Caesar Melgar's work. He is, I can't think of anybody better than him young. He's the king of the young artists in Newark. The Newark art scene is a scene composed, it's a scene. I was talking to an internationally known photographer who I won't mention his name, who said that what these cities are doing now is they're creating art scenes, not art worlds. Newark had an art world. I mean, Newark has a richer history than any place. You know, we have Sarah Vaughan and Whitney and, you know, every painter, every musician you could think about. The Newark art scene thinks that it's helping Newark. No, Newark's helping it. The Newark art scene is composed of people fleeing Brooklyn. They come into Newark and, you know, they're definitely giving it more energy and stuff. But again, they're benefiting by the energy that was already here. So the Newark art scene, I'm too old for it. I mean, you know, I don't do the cheese and crackers parties anymore. There's a lot of energy with a lot of young artists. But what's missing here in Newark is the line in the sand. When Newark had the Newark School of Fine and Industrial Artists, we had artists from all over the world. Ted Bonavito. I mean, we had famous artists, and so there was a measure with what is good art. Now everybody's an artist, but it's not just in Newark. You pick up a skateboard, in 2 weeks you're a skateboarder. You take 5 pictures with your phone, you're a photographer. You know, I like to look at these artists and I like to look at them over time and see if they're growing, see if they're learning, or if they're just, what's the word? If they're just people that want to be online, there's a word for that. You know, if they just want to be famous, you know, Newark needs vision, and Newark needs visionaries, and Newark is more concerned with, Newark's art scene is so related to the business world that I'm suspect. When you have a business feud art scene, something is lacking, you know? And so they're more worried about, all we're doing is clearing, I think they call it whitewashing or art washing. You know, all the artists here are doing is clearing the way for the business community to make apartments that they won't be able to afford. But don't get me started. You know, I'm gonna try to keep that limited. But Newark is a beautiful place loaded with a lot of artists. They just need direction. And I'm not sure if they want direction because they're too busy worrying about renting spaces. Oh, don't get me started.
Well, I think you're grounding us in the realities of what it is to be making work in the tri-state area today, and I feel like you've really taken us on this journey through your process, through your studio, through your influences, through these stories of your family and your community's histories, and it's been really transporting, especially on such a rainy, soggy night. So thank you so much for your time, Kevin. I want to let everyone on the call know that we will share a recording of this program after tonight. I know there was a lot of interest in watching this again. We hope you join us again soon, and we hope you follow Kevin's work, because I'm certainly excited to see what you make next. It's been fascinating and wonderful to hear. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for having me. And again, the American Folk Art Museum, I got to get it out real quick. This is the museum that started me out. This is the museum that supported me. Monty Blanchard, Lee Cogan, Brooke Anderson was my daughter interned with Brooke. My son worked in a gift shop. So this museum has grounded me, supported me, and inspired me. It's my favorite museum in New York. So I want to thank the museum.